some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Democracy Now!'s Nermeen Sheikh.
Thank you, Amy, and welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. School officials in Tucson, Arizona have released a list of 7 banned books that can no longer be used in classrooms after the suspension of the district's acclaimed Mexican-American Studies program. Officials told teachers to stay away from any books where, quote, race, ethnicity, and oppression are central themes. The banned books include Rethinking Columbus, The Next 500 Years, Shakespeare's play The Tempest, Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, and Chicano, The History of the Mexican Civil Rights Movement. Last month, Democracy Now! Spoke to Dr. Rodolfo Acuña, author of one of the banned books, Occupied America, A History of Chicanos, considered the definitive introduction to Chicano history.
I called it Occupied America because it didn't even refer to the United States. I said that when the Spaniards came and the Europeans came to the Americas, this was an occupation of the Americas. It was also the destruction of many cultures. Remember the Mayan culture, the Aztec culture, and many of the cultures were destroyed at that particular time, and there was an occupation. At that particular point, they lost the power of self-determination.
That was Dr. Rodolfo Acuña. Last week, the Tucson Unified School District voted to suspend its Mexican-American Studies program under the threat of losing $14 million. The vote came after a ruling that the program violates a controversial state law prohibiting the teaching of any class designed for a particular ethnic group, or that, quote, promotes resentment toward a race or class of people. The ruling went into effect after most of a lawsuit challenging it was dismissed.
Well, for more, we host a debate between 2 guests with very different views on the Ethnic Studies program. In Washington, D.C., we're joined by John Who Cant All, the Arizona Superintendent of Public Instruction, who ruled last year that Tucson's Ethnic Studies program violates state law. And in Tucson, Arizona, we're joined by Richard Martinez, the attorney representing the Ethnic Studies, Mexican-American Studies teachers and students. He's joining us from the PBS affiliate, KUAT. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Let's begin with Superintendent Who Cant All. Can you explain why the Mexican-American Studies program, why you have suspended it?
Well, I've been in the business of political leadership for 25 years, and when you have controversy, be it a zoning issue down in the corner, you get the community together, you review the issues at hand, and you bring the community back together. What you had here down in the Tucson Unified School District was basically a dysfunctional school board that had allowed a political faction to come into its campus, sort of take over these classes, and they weren't exerting the control that a school board should have in resolving this conflict. This is an education system. We have a responsibility for these children. You have to have curriculum that the community can come in and say, what are these kids learning? Week 1, week 2, week 3, that type of thing. That kind of exercise was never gone through here. And when we analyzed thousands of pages of lessons plans of what was actually taking place in these classes, it wasn't something that people would tolerate if they could see it out in the open air. Not anybody who was liberal, not anybody who was conservative. This is outside of those kind of politics. And so what we are saying is you have to go through a curriculum development process that has to be subject to the community review, community discussion. In no way, shape, or form are we banning any kind of books or any kind of viewpoint from the classroom. But we are saying that if all you're teaching these students is one viewpoint, one dimension, we can readily see that it's not an accurate history, it's not an education at all, it's not teaching these kids to think critically, but instead it's an indoctrination, and that's what we could see replete through the thousands of pages. So we're asking them to go through a healthy curriculum development process, subject to comprehensive community review and discussion, and to make sure that they are following good educational practices in general.
Superintendent Who Cant All, why do you say that no one, neither a liberal nor a conservative, would tolerate it? What's the problem with the program? And you've also said that classes such as these foster ethnic resentment. Can you explain what you mean by that and how that manifests itself?
Well, the designers of the class the classes themselves. They laid this all out in a journal article, and they explicitly said in the journal article that they were going to raciamize the classes. And in racimizing the classes, there's a philosopher in South America, controversial philosopher, because it's strictly right in his books. He uses a Marxist structure to his thinking, his philosophy. And Marx, of course, said that the entire history of mankind was a struggle between the classes. Okay. So the designers of the Mexican-American Studies classes explicitly say in their journal articles that they're going to construct Mexican-American studies around this Marxian framework with a predominantly ethnic underclass, the oppressed, filling out that Marxian model, and a predominantly Caucasian class filling out the role of the oppressor. It really is so simplistic, but it was replete through the entire article, and a lot of things very unhealthy.
Superintendent,
I mean, if somebody looked at some of the lessons, they would say, wow, this is really, you know, this isn't really Mexican-American studies. This is really a political philosophy under the disguise of Mexican-American studies.
Do you know who you're referring to, the author you're talking about, you're characterizing?
The two designers of the Mexican-American Studies in the Tucson Unified School District?
The person you're talking about whose text is used from Latin America.
Paulo Freire?
Paulo Freire, who wrote the book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed.
Yes, I've read his entire book, yes. I've read a number of his books to make sure that I had a deep understanding of what was going on in the classrooms.
Would you,
I mean, he says explicitly in his book that literally the pedagogy of the oppressed, that word oppressed is taken right out of, he says it right in the book, that word oppressed is taken right out of the Communist Manifesto, where he talks about, Karl Marx talks about the struggle of the history of the entire history of mankind being the struggle between the oppressed and the oppressors.
I want to bring in
Much
Richard
too simplistic
Martinez.
of a framework.
Superintendent Who Cant All. I want to bring in Richard Martinez, but before I do that, I just want to ask whether you think a comparable argument can be made about teaching particular aspects of European history, which I understand has not been suspended in this way.
Well, I think
since Mark was, of course, German.
I think we ought to have active discussions of all of history to make sure it's accurate, to make sure that it properly reflects a variety of viewpoints. So I don't have any simplistic view of our historical narrative, but I want to make sure that these students aren't being indoctrinated in such a way. You know, when you go back into history, there's enormous lack of civilization in history, enormous conflict between various ethnicities. It's not just in America, it's all the way back through history. And what we want to do is create a society in which everybody's working for a better tomorrow, not working to get even. And we know all the evil that came out of the Balkans in Eastern Europe, and so we want to make sure that these students are educated and be able to be critical thinkers in a variety of viewpoints.
Richard Martinez is the attorney representing teachers and students in the Mexican-American Studies program that Superintendent Who Cant All has suspended. Richard Martinez, your response?
Well, you know, it's in a short response, let me just say this. You know, Superintendent Who Cant All stated he's a politician. He's not an educator. This is a man who stepped into the class once.
Looks like we may have just lost Richard Martinez, but he's back. Go ahead, Mr. Martinez.
Let me respond to that.
Mr. Martinez is back in line. Let's let him make his point. Richard Martinez.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Okay, John Who Cant All, make your point. We've just lost Richard Martinez off the satellite. We'll get him on the phone so we can make sure we have this discussion.
I was challenged to come into the classroom, and as he said, I did visit the classroom, and it was an enlightening experience because it was consistent with the narrative that I just talked about. When I come into class, they have a poster of Che Guevara up on the wall, and I said, do you all know that Che Guevara helped direct the communist death camps in Cuba? that under that regime, they put to death 14,000 dissidents, many of whom their only violation is what we would call free speech rights. And while I was in the class, they characterized Benjamin Franklin as a racist. The contradiction there, glorifying Che Guevara, who ran death camps in Cuba, and vilifying Benjamin Franklin as a racist. Benjamin Franklin was the president of the Abolitionist Society in Pennsylvania. It was under his direct influence that Pennsylvania became the first state to outlaw the slave trade. Benjamin Franklin, out of his own pocket, paid for the very first schools for African Americans in this country and perhaps in the whole world. So you can characterize him as a racist. There's some kind of historical record there because of the attitudes and beliefs at that time. But to characterize him as just that and not to talk about his whole record and not to talk about how he was actively working and planning for how we could get out of the slave trade, how we could free African Americans, is to not do justice to history and to give these kids a distorted view of what America's all about. This is a great country. You have lots of opportunities. Anyone. The odds are stacked against you. I grew up in South Tucson. So when I go down to Tucson Unified School District, I'm going home. And Marcelino Lucero taught me long division in 3rd grade. Stella Peralta defeated me every week in the spelling bee. I know these kids are sharp kids, that they're fully capable of being architects and doctors and, God forbid, lawyers and you name it. And Tucson Unified School District, this ethnic studies controversy is just one aspect of their incompetence and their failure. They have
bring Richard Martinez back into
derated schools.
Let me bring Richard Martinez back into the discussion. We have you suited up with a phone as well as the satellite. Can you respond?
Well, Superintendent Who Cant All is vilifying Mexican-American Studies program. It's very broad scope and a complete lack of specifics. As I said earlier, he's responding as a politician. He's not an educator. This is a person who paid $110,000 to have professional educators come in and audit this program, the Cambian audit team, and found absolutely no violation of the statute. What Superintendent Who Cant All fails to acknowledge is, one, that he passed the bill as a state senator specifically aimed at ending the Mexican-American Studies program in Tucson, Arizona. He also, as superintendent, ignored the Cambian audit, which he paid for, and found no violation. To this date, he can't define any of the terms in HB 2281. He can't tell us what it is a teacher does or says that violates the statute. A law requires that a teacher know what it is they say or do that would violate this statute. This statute is completely flawed, and what it represents essentially is a modern-day form of McCarthyism. We have a superintendent who has abolished the most successful program for Mexican-American students in the history of Tucson Unified School District, and I would match this program against any program throughout the state of Arizona. He has ignored the academic successes from this program. This program has closed the achievement gap for more students than any other program. It has graduated more students from high school at higher rates than any other program, and it has sent more students to college than any other program. So Superintendent Who Cant All, essentially what he's engaged in is a right-wing agenda to end a program that allows Latino students to look critically at their situation, at their community, and at their state. And, to look at the history of this country in terms of what has gone well, but those things that have gone very wrong.
Richard Martinez, we're going to break for a moment, then we're going to come back to this discussion. Richard Martinez, an attorney representing teachers and students of the Mexican-American Studies program that has just been suspended in Tucson, Arizona by Superintendent Who Cant All, who is also on the line with us, the Arizona Superintendent of Public Instruction. We'll come back to this discussion in just a moment.